Hey guys, this is Ram from CrossMind Studio. Welcome back to another tutorial which is about rigid body simulations inside the Blender. Rigid body simulations are quite fun thing to do, especially if you're starting with this whole 3D thing and animation. So while the animating things manually will take quite a lot of practice, and it's quite a deep subject to study, rigid body simulations can help you quickly achieve physically accurate simulations with the help of just a few clicks. Even though the Blender's simulation system at this moment is quite limited and there are no ways to achieve very elaborated effects which you might have seen in the Houdini or 3ds Max thinking particles and all that, but there are still few quite interesting things you can do with rigid body simulations, and hopefully in the future when we have everything node, we will be able to do much complex effects. So what you've seen in the tutorial trailer, that's what we are going to do. We are going to create 4 different scenes and discuss 4 different things about rigid body simulations, including very basics of the rigid bodies, then using the force fields, using the fractures, and also combining multiple things to achieve something realistic, which is like a totem, what you've seen in the trailer. So we'll also talk about material breakdown. So let's get started. So over here I have this scene which is quite simple. There's nothing much going on. It's just a ground plane. There are a few balls over here. So we are going to create this scene into much more complex one later, but let's just talk about very basic stuff first without actually making this one heavy. So by default, when you play any animation, unless you have any keyframes on the timeline, so let's say if I auto key this one and auto key this one over here, so this is going to play. I mean, other than that, there is nothing going to happen to any of the geometry, any of the objects in the viewport. But there are quite a few fun stuff with the rigid body you can do. Rigid body's concept is quite similar across all the 3D packages. But there is one active rigid body and one is the passive rigid body. So if I want this ball to behave like an actual object which has mass, it should fall down and behave like there is a gravity in the scene, like how everything behaves in the physical world. Then what I'll have to do is assign this object a rigid body and make this one into active. So by default it's set to active. Now if I play my animation, it's going to fall right across this plane and for as long as my timeline lasts over here. Now what I would want here is basically this plane to work as floor. So like I said, there is one active body and there is one passive rigid body. So active rigid body basically going to, if you want to have some motion into any object, you can use active rigid body on that object. And if you want any object to stay stationed and only work as collider, then you can use a rigid body and change this into passive. And keep in mind, I'm in the physics properties over here. So as soon as I do that, this thing is going to fall down, and when it hits the ground, it's going to just stop over here. Now, even though this is interacting with the gravity and falling down, but the motion of the ball is not quite convincing. I mean, it just falling down. In the real life, the motion is much more different. I mean, I expect this ball to roll, have some secondary motion, and not just stop when it collides with the plane. So now for that, what we can do is basically change the shape of the rigid body. So if you go to the properties of rigid body, over here you can see the collision. By default, it sets to Convex Hole. Now what this means is, doesn't matter how complex the geometry is, it's going to wrap a very simplified mesh around it and use that for simulation. So let's say if this had 50,000 polygons, then the rigid body Convex Hole is going to create a very low resolution mesh around it, and that will help the simulator to solve the simulation much faster. But at the same time, it could oversimplify the motion sometimes. So what you can do is you can change this into many different shapes. So there's a box, sphere, anything which resembles your shape of the object, you can do that from here. And if you don't find, I mean, if the shape is very organic or anything, then you can always change this into mesh. So let's try sphere for over here and see if there is any change in the motion. So no, I don't see any difference. So let's change this into mesh. Now as soon as I do that, you can see now there are much more points being calculated, and now this behaving much better than before. Now other than that, now over here on top of everything there is mass, and this can actually change the behavior of an object. So if it's a very lighter object, so if I make this one into 0.1 kg or 0.001 kg, then the result is going to be different. And if I change this one into 1000 kg, then it's going to drop much faster. Now if I select this ball over here and increase the bounciness, you will be able to see much more bounce going on. And let's do the same for the ground plane. I'll increase the timeline. Alright, so we have at least a bouncing motion in the ball. So let's talk about the very basic parameters over here, what we see and what this all means first. So the weight, the mass over here basically means the weight of the mass of the rigid body, and the heavier the object is, it's going to behave like a heavier object, and the lighter it is, it's going to behave like a lighter object. So let's say if I have one, this one is 0.1 kg, and if I make a duplicate of this one and make that into 1000 kg, so I hope I will be able to see the difference. Yeah, so this 1000 kg is bouncing less, and this 0.1 kg is bouncing more. And now similarly, if I show you a better example over here, so if I move this lighter object on top of this one and play my animation, so it's just going to bounce on top of this and fall down. But if I bring the heavier object on the top, then it's going to actually kick that ball out of the scene, because this is almost like 1000 times heavier. So the behavior is quite significantly different. So this is one of the example. And now other than the mass, we have there are two different things, and we'll talk about the animated later. So basically what animated means is, if you want one animated object to participate in rigid body simulation, then you can enable this one. So let's say, okay, I'll just give you a quick example. I'll make one copy of this and change this one into animated, and as soon as I do that, you can see all that animation is gone. Now right now it's shooting away, and okay, not sure what the reason is. I think it's to do with this one. So if I move this away, yeah, so let's change the sensitivity to margin to 0 maybe. Yeah, so if I create one key over here, let's say over here, if I press I and click on the location and go over here and again move this over here and set another key, then by default, if I disable this, then even though this have key, it's not going to actually move this way, because it's working as a dynamic object over here and not animated object. So for simulator to keep that animation which we just created over here, you will have to enable animated over here. And as soon as I do that, you can see how this one is working as an animated object but still colliding with this one. All right, other than this, and this dynamic one is quite basic. If you want to just quickly toggle on and off whether this object is dynamic or not, you can do that from here. Now in the collision properties over here, as we just discussed, there are a few presets which can actually give you a basic shape for your basic primitives if you have. But for more complex geometry, I think you will have to either use mesh, convex hull. Like if it's an organic geometry, then these are the options for that. And let's bring some complex shape over here. Let's bring one Suzanne model over here. So I'll just apply a rigid body preset on this one and play our animation, see what's going on. So by default, as expected, it's just going to fall down and behave like a rigid body. Now, if I increase the number of subdivisions into this one, I just press Control 1 and that brings up a subdivision over here, and then we can just apply this one and shade smooth. So if I use this now for rigid body, it's a much smoother mesh, but even then our result is quite similar to previous one. I mean, there is very less motion, and doesn't matter how many polygons I add over here, it's just going to give us the same result, because there is a proxy mesh going on around here which we can't see. So if I change this from Convex Hole to mesh, then you might be able to see much more motion into this one. Yeah, as you can see over here, it rolls much more, and it has much more detail in the shape. So that is not the only use for the mesh or the Convex Hole. Now I'll show you another example. So basically Convex Hole is like let's say if you have glass, if this is a glass, then the Convex Hole is just going to wrap one geometry around this one and just pack it nicely. So this is going to just wrap it like this. All right, so if the geometry have like holes or invert shapes, like if it's a hollow object, then that is actually going to not work in the rigid body. Like if you expect any ball to fall inside this object, then the Convex Hole will not provide you that effect, because it's just wrapping a very proxy mesh around everything. Now let's say if I bring one UV sphere over here and delete half of these and assign this one a rigid body. I'll bring this over here so we can see what's going on. So by default, I'll just move this one slightly above. Yeah, so by default, the Convex Hole is going to just pack any holes or the concave shapes, and nothing is going to actually fall inside this hollow object. So we can solve that by using mesh over here. So if I change this into mesh, then you can see the rigid bodies are falling inside it. Alright, so that's one of the use for using mesh. Now, using mesh for collision geometry will not always be a practical solution. So if you're using for something much complex, if there is a character model or maybe a sculpt or maybe mountains or rocks, like if there are like hundreds of thousands of pieces, then mesh for the collision source is going to just slow down the performance of the simulation, and would even give you something which is really unstable and not usable. So if I have to give you an example, then using a really high resolution geometry for simulation is not a great idea. So if I make a chain out of this model, set origin to geometry, and subdivide this one a few times, let's say 2 times, then I can just apply rigid body on this one, change this to mesh. I'll make a few copies of this. So trying to solve high resolution geometry with the rigid body is going to basically give you much slower performance. So as you can see over here, there are quite a few models. Now imagine if there were hundreds of these, then the simulation will take quite some time to solve each frame. As you can see over here, it's already struggling to keep the simulation together. So instead of using mesh data for high resolution models, what you can do is you can create your own manual proxy model and use that for simulation. So let's say if I delete these, sorry, I'll just clean this up and create one duplicate model and decimate and bring the resolution down to something usable. Yeah, something like this. So we have this mesh, and I'm going to parent this mesh with a high resolution one. And now in the high resolution model, we can change the shape to compound parent. Now this parent object's child, this low resolution model, is going to convert into compound shape. Now over here you can see this object is part of compound shape. So it's going to automatically pick it up, the parent object and the child, that configuration, and assign this one as a proxy mesh. Now if I select the low resolution model and make sure this one is set to shape, the mesh, and create a chain similar to the previous example. Now let's try to solve this one. You can see the performance is much smoother and it's almost like a real time. So that's the use of compound shapes, and it can actually give you much more control over how you handle your simulations with the high resolution models. So you're not always limited to these shapes or these presets. You can always make your own shape and use that for simulation. So let's talk about the next thing. Alright, so the further parameters are quite simple to understand. If I select the ground plane, you can see there is friction and bounciness. So by default, if you play this animation, you can see just like before, we have a very standard animation going on, nothing much. So if I increase the bounciness on the ball over here, you should be able to see a bounce. So at this moment, I think the ground plane doesn't have any bounciness. So if I increase the bounciness on the ground as well, you should be able to see bounciness on this one. Now, if I change this shape to mesh, just like before, for the both of the parts, then I can see much more twist. Now let's bring down the bounciness a little over here for both of these objects, and let's talk about the friction. So friction basically means how much the object resists the motion. So as you can see, the resistance of the object to movement. So the much more friction you have, the much faster the object is going to stop. Like if it's rolling, then it's just going to roll less if it has more friction. So if the ground have a zero friction, then I should be able to see for the ground and for the ball. So let's just tilt this plane slightly so we can see what's going on. So now this plane is tilted and you can see the ball is rolling in this direction. Now if I increase the friction for the ground and for the ball, you can see it's rolling less, but at the same time there is much more realistic motion to it. It's like the motion and the rotation is in the perfect sync. So it's without the friction, it was working more like a slippery surface. So even though we had a tilted plane, there was more motion but less friction. So with the friction, you can see as soon as I increase the friction on this one, it's like a rough surface, and the ball is rolling more, but at the same time there is a resistance in the motion. Let's increase the bounciness and tilt the plane slightly further. So I hope you get the idea what's going on over here. And the next one is the margin. So margin basically means how much margin you want to keep between the geometries. So if I increase this one to something like 5, then you will see there is a gap in between, and like this one. And if I make this one 0, then it's going to make a perfect contact. Unless the other object have some sort of distance sensitivity as well. So that's about it. That's everything to know about the rigid body's basic parameters over here. And then there is another section which is in the scene properties over here. From here you can control the speed of the simulation. If I make this one into 0.2, then you will see a kind of slow motion shot. If I make this one into 5, then yeah, it's going to be faster simulation. And split impulse basically means sometimes you will see some extra velocity building up between the object, and like if the objects are much closer to each other, or if there's some tightly packed geometry or something like that, then that could give you a very unstable simulation. So if you enable this one, then split impulse basically is going to subdue that velocity and give you something much more usable. So after that we have solver iterations. So by default this number is set to 10, and if you want much more accurate results, then try increasing these numbers. If I increase this number, I don't think for such simple example we will be able to see much difference. If I make this one into 1, yeah. So I'll explain this one later, maybe when we are working with the fractures and all. So more solver iterations, just like when we were working with the Mantaflow. So for any simulation, more iterations means much more data is being fed into, much more substeps are being fed into simulation. And after that we have simulation cache settings. So you can bake from here, extend your animation simulation timelines, and that's about it. And then the standard field weight settings from here, you can control the force field parameters. Any force field which you have in the scene, you can control the influence of those force fields from here. Alright, so now just to conclude this chapter, we are going to add much more objects to this one, create a finished render out of this. Alright, so here I am in the final file, and there are multiple copies of the same object with the varying sizes. So now we are going to discuss one more final thing before concluding this chapter, and I'll talk about the material breakdown in a moment. So when we have multiple objects, so instead of trying to apply a rigid body on multiple objects and trying to transfer it, there is no way of transferring it. So what you can do is basically select everything, and from the object menu you can click on the rigid body and click add active. And this way we have rigid body applied on multiple shapes. So ground basically needs to be static. You can change this from active to passive, and then if I hit play, then yeah, we have a very basic simulation going on. So the way to manage multiple objects is basically you can either right click, hold Alt. So let's say if I want to change anything on this one, if I want to increase the friction for all of these, then I can hold Alt and increase it from here. That way the friction is 1 for rest of these objects as well. Or you can let's say if I change this one into mesh, and then you can right click and copy to selected. And these are the two methods of applying and changing the properties of the multiple rigid bodies. So let's apply bounciness on the ground, change this one into mesh, and bounciness on the balls, and friction all the way, something like this. And let's hit the play and see what's going on. So I think there was some sort of overlapping between objects for initial frames. That's why it was taking a few seconds for earlier frames to calculate, but later frames are much faster. Now over here you can see, I think we have around 50 or 100 of object in the scene, and even though these are quite decent resolution, like low resolution, these are like, it's still taking some time to calculate. Now I think I may have increased the substeps. So by default these are set to 10, yeah, something like this. So let's try to solve this one with the default substeps. Should be much faster. Yeah. So we'll set up everything, and for the final substeps we are going to increase the final result, we are going to increase the substeps. So for this simulation, what I want to do is basically bring a force field. So I have this force field over here. It's a very basic force field which is set right behind the pile of the balls over here, and I have enabled the max distance for this force field to be right to cover the initial burst, and the influence is still over here. So I just want the initial kick to happen. The strength is set to quite higher, and since the rigid bodies have a weight, so the lower strength in the force fields won't show you any significant result, like evident result. So try working with the higher number, the strength, and that's about it. And this way we should be able to see all these balls moving in this direction. Yep. So that's what I was expecting. There you go. Now if you want, you can always create sort of a boxy wall around it and use that as a mesh collision shape, and that way anything which is falling out of the scene will always bounce back from those colliding walls and stay within the scene. But I don't think we are losing much over here, so I won't bother much about it. There you go. So I think we have quite decent result, and the only thing I would like to do about this is, just to be sure we are getting a good simulation, I'll just increase the solver iteration and solver substeps, and yeah, then hit the bake, and it's going to freeze all your simulation. So there I have it, the final simulation, and yeah, now I quite like the result. I think I could have spent some more time on it, but there is no particular aim I just wanted to give you a very simple example. The only thing which I forgot to mention is the source shape over here. So if you have any sort of I'll give you a quick example. File image. So if you have like a geometry where the shape of the geometry is like kind of deformed, so let's say if I have a displace modifier with any texture like distorted noise, and this one is set to 0.2, something simple, shade smooth, and over here let's bring one standard UV sphere. Oops. So if I set this one to rigid body and set this one to rigid body passive, give this one slight tilt. Now let's scale this up. Now even though it's colliding with this plane, it's not quite respecting the shape of this geometry. So if I change this one into mesh, then you will see all those bumpy ride going on for the ball. But the thing is, like sometimes if you don't see that effect, just make sure this is set to final, the source shape is set to final. If this one is set to base, then anything which is before the modifiers, that shape will be considered for the collision. And if you want the final shape, which is after the collision, after the modifiers to be taken into the account, then the final shape from here, you'll have to change that. So just a thing to keep in mind. That's about it. So let's go back to the file and talk about the shader. Now for the material, I'll give you a breakdown what's going on. So for these balls, I have a very basic material. It looks quite messed up over here, but I'll give you an example of what's going on. So for the color of these balls, basically what's going on is, so basically I used gradient texture, which is set to linear and with the generated coordinates. And then on top of that, I used color ramp just to make some hard lines around the center over here. So you can make as many lines as you want. Now on top of this color ramp over here, I'm using a hue saturation node. So basically what's going on in this hue saturation node, I just pick any color which you want, and then in the hue over here, just bring one input object info node and select random and plug that into hue, and this way you'll get random color for each different object. All right, and you combine that one with this ramp over here and you'll get a colorful stripe for each of the ball. And you can control any aspect about this one, like how you want to change colors, anything like hue, saturation value. If you want to randomize the saturation as well, you can do that from here. If you want to randomize the value, you can do that from here. So just pick any color and randomize it with the object info node, and yeah, that's about it for the base color. And then I believe there is one texture which I'm using for this overall scene. It's a very standard PBR shader. I downloaded from the HDR, the texture heaven, and but I wanted on top of this plain flat color, I wanted to mix this one with a hint of like a rough dirt. So I just used a random texture. So I was quite lazy to do this, so I just used the same texture which I'm using on the ground, the roughness map from that one, and multiplied this into a mix node. So there you go, you have some sort of scratches going on. And the same node I'm using in the roughness, and there is one normal map which I'm using into the normal map. So the ground plane basically have a PBR shader. So these maps basically I just dumped it on top of the balls over here. Alright, I'll leave this file on the Gumroad, and my Patreon users can use will get this file for free. So you can just study this file if you want. There's nothing complex. I'll just enlarge the view in case if you guys want to study this. Alright, so basically there's a color going on over here. Create one basic stripes with a gradient and a color ramp. Post that, you can just use a randomized color with the object info node, and just so that you get some dirt on the balls, but bring any random texture which have some sort of scratches or roughness. You can multiply that with you can mix that with the base color, and just to break the roughness of the specular, I'm using a roughness map, which is this one, and also a normal map from the ground I'm using on top of this ball. I just wanted these balls not to exactly look like flat. If I disable everything and keep the color, these looks quite boring. Alright, so you get the point. And once you have everything, you have such a beautiful animation going on. Just have fun with this, bring different cameras. So for the final render, I used 128 samples with the OpticX denoiser with the cycles. Now with the cycles, you can see the result look much better. However, for such a simple scene, you can always use EV. So I have a HDR in the background, which is, let me just bring one HDR node. So I don't think I'm using any HDR over here. So it's just blank node. So for the lights, I have quite a few lights over here. So multiple colored light shooting from different angles, and I have a blue light from here, and then there is a source light on top of everything, which is just creating this main centered bright lit area. That's about it. And you can always use some sort of abstract shapes to create interesting shadows in your scene and cut out lighting from unnecessary parts, just so that you have a certain focus in certain area. And after that, just bring your cameras and record the view from different views, different angles. I have multiple cameras going on over here. Camera number 2, camera number 1. And then edit your shots, render it out. For each frame, it took me around 1 or 2 minutes on my configuration. You can see my configuration in the description. And yeah, for depth of field, I think I have depth of field enabled for all the shots. So, and even though I have used cycles for this one, I think you can use EV. And even with the EV, this scene looks quite beautiful, and nothing will ever look bad with such colorful things going on in your scene. All right, so even with the EV, you can see we have almost everything. All right, so just play around with the file if you want, and or maybe create your own version. I would love to see it. So tag me on the Instagram, share your scenes with CrossMind. The next example we are going to discuss is this one. So basically, instead of creating a simple animation, we are going to use negative forces, and we are going to talk about a method to create abstract negative forces. And this way you will have this nice simulation. So over here you can see different attraction points, and sometimes the simulation attracts on the top left and the bottom right, so things are moving in a chaotic order, and it looks nice. All right, so we'll talk about this one in the next chapter. So I'll see you in the next chapter. Stay tuned, subscribe, and do check out my Patreon. I'm planning to do a one-on-one session with my first 10 supporters, first 10 Patreons. So there are I'm open for the feedback. I'm doing this for the first time and I'm quite nervous, but open for the suggestions. So if you guys have any suggestions of the subscription or the features you want to suggest, I'm all ears, and let's make this work. Yeah, so I'll see you in the next chapter. The links are in the description. Stay tuned. Bye bye. Take care.